Hello and welcome to the 25th Annual Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit organization housed within Eastern Washington University. Our program is responsible for Get Lit, Washington State's longest-running annual literary festival, which hosts readings, writing workshops, craft classes, panel discussions, and more, featuring many talented writers from our region and beyond. The festival takes place this Thursday through Sunday, April 20th through 23rd, in many venues across downtown Spokane. And of course, we're very happy to be back with you in this virtual space as well. You can find a full schedule of in-person and virtual events, along with information about all of our festival authors, by visiting our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to introduce Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator, Liz Graves, who will tell us about today's event.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for EWU MFA alumni around the globe. In this panel, 6 writers who have all earned their MFA in creative writing from Eastern Washington University will engage in a cross-cultural dialogue about the importance of place and identity in their writing. The authors, who have all spent time living abroad, will share notes about the similarities and differences in their places and experiences, and how these have been translated on the page, using specific examples from their own work. The panelists include Krista DeBehnke Attana, Jim Hagengruber, Jessica Lakritz, and Monet Thomas. The panel will be moderated by Jeff Fearnside and Wendy J. Fox. Before we get to today's conversation, Kate and I will introduce our hosts, Jeff and Wendy. Wendy J. Fox is the author of 4 books of fiction, including the novel If the Ice Had Held, a LitHub Best Pick in Audio, and the recent short story collection, What If We Were Somewhere Else, which won the Colorado Book Award for Literary Fiction and earned a star for excellence in the genre of short stories from Booklist. She has written for national publications like The Rumpus, Catapult, Electric Literature, Self, Business Insider, The Muse, and Ms. Her work has appeared in literary magazines, including Washington Square, Euphemy, and the Painted Bride Quarterly. She writes a biannual list for BuzzFeed focusing on the great works of small presses.
Thanks, Liz. And Jeff Fearnside is the author of 2 full-length books and 2 chapbooks, most recently Ships in the Desert and A Husband and Wife Are One Satan, winner of the Orison Chapbook Prize. His work has appeared widely in literary journals and anthologies such as the Paris Review, Los Angeles Review, Story, The Sun, and Forest Understory. Awards for his writing include a grand prize in the Santa Fe Writers Project, the Mary Mackey Short Story Prize, and an Islands International Book Award. Fearnside lived in Central Asia for 4 years and taught writing and literature in Kazakhstan and various institutions in the US. Currently, Jeff teaches at Oregon State University. Please welcome Jeff and Wendy, who will be running today's event. Thank you, Jeff and Wendy.
Thanks, Kate. I'd like to introduce 2 of our panelists, starting with Monet Thomas, who is a writer living in Beijing, China. Monet holds an MFA in poetry from Eastern Washington University, and her essays have been featured in Burn It Down, Women Writing About Anger, and Letter to a Stranger, Essays to Ones Who Haunt Us. And her flash fiction has been featured in Wigleaf Top 50 and in the Best Small Fictions 2018 anthology, selected by Amy Bender. Her poems, fiction, and nonfiction can all be found online. Thanks, Monet, for joining us. And I'd also like to introduce Jim Hagengruber, who worked for the Spokesman Review as he earned his MFA in nonfiction, graduating in 2007. After more than a decade in journalism, with datelines ranging from a small town in Montana to Ukraine to a combat outpost in Anbar, Iraq, Jim joined the Foreign Service. His diplomatic postings have included Bosnia, India, Cabo Verde, and Serbia. He's currently completing a master's degree at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and will begin a new assignment this summer with the State Department's Bureau of African Affairs. He and his wife are the proud parents of a daughter, as well as a street dog from Cabo Verde. Thanks, Jim, for joining us.
Thanks, Wendy. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Krista DeBehnke Attana, a poet, playwright, and educator from Wisconsin. She received an MFA in poetry from Eastern Washington University and a PhD in English, drama, and folklore from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Her first chapbook of poetry, Like Thunder, Like Daughter, was published by Dancing Girl Press in 2021. Other poetry and drama works have appeared in Mask and Spectacle, Saranac Review, Apurinian Review, and Bateau Ivre, among others. Her first stage production, On the Way to Harlem, was produced by Payne College for their 21st Evelyn G. Etheridge Conference on the Harlem Renaissance. Jessica Lakritz is an American writer and poet based in Mexico City. In 2010, she graduated from EWU with an MFA in poetry and has been a professional freelance writer since 2013. Jessica has published 2 books of poetry and spent 6 years immersed in a multimedia poetry project called Skin on Sundays, where she wrote poetry on human canvases. However, she's now transitioning to other poetry-based multimedia art with collage and photography. Jessica loves dogs, the sea, travel, hammocks, and not taking herself too seriously. Welcome, everyone. We're very happy to have you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll go ahead and start with the first question, which is a little bit actually of a housekeeping question. So my connection to the MFA around the globe is that I lived in Turkey for 2 years in the early 2000s. And one of the things that sometimes people say to me when I mention living in Turkey is, why Turkey? And the answer is that for me, it was really opportunistic. It wasn't something I had sought out. I had the chance to take over the second year of a 2-year contract from someone who didn't want to do that second year. And just for context, that person is Greg Spatz's neighbor. So a lot of people will know Greg. He's been in the program for a very long time. And, you know, I was young. I didn't have a whole lot going on. So I said yes. And it was an amazing and unexpected experience. So I'm just curious about other people's choices. Why did you make that choice, or was it a choice at all? And maybe we can start with you, Monet.
Why me? Yeah, no, it wasn't really a choice. I was coming off of a very bad breakup, and I wanted to get as far away as possible. So that was China. So it's as simple as that. I just had to get away, and China was where I ran away to. Mm-hmm.
How about the others? I know my own experience was I was at a point in my life right after grad school where I could have stayed in a very good job and been happy. And I looked at my situation and I said, if I do that, if I take that track, I'll never get to do my dream of going into the Peace Corps. And so for me, it was a now or never kind of a moment. I just decided, even though I was in my 30s, I had a good job, I was going to do this thing that I loved, and I did it, and I never looked back. I never regretted it.
I think mine was very much the same, like a now or never kind of moment. Thankfully, my partner had a fully online job, and I kind of freaked out during COVID, and I was like, I don't know what I want to do. So I applied for a study abroad teaching program in Costa Rica, and then I just kept coming back. So it was, if I don't do this now, I'm never going to be able to do this again. So that was my decision. So it was definitely a choice.
Yeah, mine was.
I was laid off from the Spokesman Review about a year after I graduated. And the night before I was laid off, I bought a one-way ticket to Indonesia. I was going to do a sabbatical for 6 months. And when I got laid off, I kind of panicked, but I thought, well, I got the ticket. I have a small payout. Let's just do it. So I spent 6 months traveling. I did some freelancing in Iraq for the Christian Science Monitor, and money was drying up a little bit. And I had like really bad old body armor. And I remember meeting some people. I'm like, oh, they have life or health insurance and good gear. They were with the State Department, and they seemed to have intellectual freedom, and they spoke openly and freely. And I thought, well, what the hell? I'll do that. I remember a conversation John Keeble, the great professor, once told me. We were on a break from a workshop, and he said something, you know, if I had to do it all over again, I think I would go to Uzbekistan. Not quite sure why Uzbekistan, but I remember just kind of planted a little bit of a seed of like, it's a big old world out there. So go see it, and hopefully in someone else's time.
My experience was, I was 24 when I graduated the MFA program, and I thought that I knew that I was too young to really jump into a career based on what I wanted for myself. So I moved to Argentina to be like a bohemian writer. And I thought I was going to get a teaching job, and I didn't really think it through. So I ended up moving there at the beginning of their summer. No teaching jobs really available. And I just had to kind of figure it out in that moment. And that's when I started freelance writing, really horrible jobs at first. But I ended up moving back to the States. And after a couple of years, I was like, I don't think I'm done yet. And I ended up in Portland for a couple of years, got an opportunity to rent a really affordable place in Zihuatanejo, Mexico. And kind of similarly, I was going to just take a 6-month sabbatical and finish writing my poetry book. And I have not moved back to the States. That was 2013.
Well, Jessica, I think it's a badge of honor for every writer to have gone through a few horrible jobs. So that's okay.
Yeah, it definitely was character building.
Well,
So let's switch over to we'd like to hear from some of our panelists with just a short reading. We're going to start with half of us, starting with Monet, Jim, and Krista, who have a short reading prepared for the audience.
Sounds good, Wendy.
So Monet, we'll keep the same order. Why don't you go ahead and start?
Sure. So it was hard to find something short, but I went with something from the letter that I usually write to my friends and family back home. As I said, I ran away from home to escape heartbreak. And that was in 2016. And I wrote this in 2021. So I miss diners. Those Saturday mornings when he'd roll over and ask, "You want to go get breakfast?" And then the prime trio of water, coffee, and a small cup of orange juice was crowding the table. Quiet clatter of silverware and the hangover receding with every bite of pancake. I miss how sometimes we got drunk and then argued, went to bed mad, and breakfast was the truce. Sometimes we fell in love again, remembering those early days when the waitress had to tap the table with her pen to get our attention. I loved you, sticky tacky menu. Even though I always ordered the same thing, I believed a person should always look and see if maybe they wanted something else. But looking for me always confirmed that my desires never changed. So.
Thank you. Jim?
Well, I don't have anything fresh that I want to read. I'll just, my job, I unfortunately have to get things approved or screened before I publish. So for the last 14 years, I've been publishing under a pseudonym, and I'm not ready yet to risk my retirement benefits to unveil the pseudonym. It's in a German newspaper and magazine. I just had agreement from Smithsonian to publish my first sort of named piece coming up here pretty soon on a project I've been working on for a while on a Civil War sailor, a Black sailor from Cabo Verde that the Navy has mistakenly listed as being from Canada. And it's a project I've worked on for a long time, and finally have the Navy agreeing that this guy is not Canadian, he's African. So I'm pretty excited on that. That should be coming out anytime soon. but I'm not prepared to read from it at this point until it's published. But I sure do write a lot on my own. It's a piece that's missing from me that I'm not publishing, but it is a trade-off that I've had to make for this job. And I don't feel comfortable getting prior review on most of my pieces. So I've just decided I'm just going to hold on to them and publish them en masse in 6 years when I'm eligible to retire. So I'll save you all from the agony of listening to my dry journalism.
Thanks, Tim. That actually offers a really interesting context of, kind of all of the things that we go through as writers in different positions. Krista.
Sure. So over the last year when I was in Costa Rica, I started writing these like little excerpts of nonfiction, which is totally weird for me, which kind of maybe we'll talk about later. Usually I write poetry and drama. So I've got a short excerpt that I'm going to read. All right. We were standing in a sea of metal studs and black shirts. Most of them bore the iconic Metallica logo. I was itchy all over. My face looked like it had been used as a dartboard. I felt like some sort of addict. The mosquitoes followed me wherever I went. Last year, when my partner and I came to rural Costa Rica to teach with the semester abroad program, we took every opportunity to experience the varying topography of the country. On one of those excursions, we ended up in Cartago, which is the original capital. We checked out the Central Market and found a karaoke bar. My husband, Drew, tried his hand at a ranchero song with little success. A punk kid at heart, he insisted we find a crusty place, somewhere that fans of fringe music felt at home. And as such, the universe answered. We stumbled by a bar called La Reforma, a place we would later be strongly advised against visiting due to our skin tone and naivety about this new country. Though that night we made out okay and even made some new friends, one of which was Ignacio, who went by the nickname Nacho and had some familial ties to an infamous Escobar a few hundred miles south. He and his partner Jessica invited us back to their place to continue the party. We bonded over 90s sitcoms and sports and discovered that Nacho just happened to be the singer of Whiplash, the #1 Metallica tribute band in Costa Rica. Nearly a year later, after we sold our house and our cars and all the little trinkets that we thought defined us, we were standing with Jessica on a wet San Jose side street beneath a bright marquee bearing the name Whiplash. We were behind schedule, but we would be taking the stage soon. And while I waited and scratched at my many bites, I asked, "Do Costa Ricans get bit this much?" "No, not really," Jessica said. Rather than respond, I scratched some more. "Krista, it's because of your blood," Jessica said. "You've got that sweet gringo blood."
Thank you.
Thank you. That Metallica tribute band in Costa Rica reminds me of my time in Kazakhstan. The #1 song I heard the most was the Eagles' Hotel California, but the live version, always the live version. That was very popular. Well, let's move on to some more questions. I'm really curious how all of you feel your time overseas has contributed to your personal growth, both as a human and as a writer. I can lead if you want.
I can jump in. I mean,
yeah, jump in, Jim.
For me, I guess I've been overseas the last 13 years for the most part until this year, and just more seeing the risks that so many non-American writers or people where I've lived, and the personal risks that they have to go through. And a lot of these are journalists, but what they're willing to put up to write, and the struggles that they have to endure. I mean, really coming from very little money in the first place, so it's a huge choice just to go down that path, because usually they're in small markets. They're places like Cabo Verde or Bosnia, where it's not like there's a giant pool of people to buy their work. So it's more in awe, just kind of being in awe of these writers who continue to struggle. A lot of times they've faced political pressures, sometimes arrests, and so and I work a lot with journalists and trying to support them in any way that I can through my work at the embassy or embassies, and and so it's just raised my awareness of the importance of these writers and kind of the precariousness in which they live, these situations. And it kind of made me feel a lot like, boy, my time as a reporter in America, we had a couple of death threats here and there, and a few white supremacists up in northern Idaho that would pester us, but didn't face widespread political repression. And that just opens up a whole new world. And how grateful I am that I didn't have to deal with that. But it also shows, like, when you work with groups like PEN International, other groups that come to the rescue and aid of writers, I wasn't that aware of their work while I was in the US, and how vital they are and how vital it is for us to support them as writers wherever we are in the world. You got to band together.
Have any of the rest of you been inspired by the other writers you've met in your time overseas, or maybe that you've read that you wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise?
I have had that experience, actually. One of my favorite poets now, his name is Mario Benedetti. He's from Uruguay. And most of his work isn't translated to English, which is insane to me because he's one of the most prolific poets that I've ever read now. And I'm fluent in Spanish, but I wouldn't call myself like I'm not a native speaker. Poetry is still like the most difficult thing to read. But I can read his poetry and really feel it. And there's obviously no way that I would be as exposed to his work because most of it's not translated into English. Had I not learned Spanish living in Spanish-speaking countries. That's been really cool. I mean, also to answer the question, there's so much that's inspiring about being in places that are unfamiliar, that just kind of get the cogwheels of the brain moving in a different way. I think that more than anything else, especially after so long living abroad, I'm not like that situation isn't the same for me as it was at the beginning when I'm writing about like new tastes and smells and culture. Like now that has become commonplace for me since I've been living in Mexico for so long. But it's so interesting the way that things work differently, that your perspective changes about privilege, especially, and just what's important and what isn't important. Like you grow up with a lot of creature comforts, or I did, just like always having hot water is a good example. And I usually have hot water, but when there isn't hot water, for example, I'm not gonna get upset about it. I'm just gonna take a cold shower and maybe think about the benefits of cold showers in the meantime, that sort of thing.
I think the hot water thing can be a pretty consistent experience that we're very used to in the U.S. If you turn on the hot water comes out, and it's certainly not like that way everywhere in the world at all. It's every other day or twice a week. When I was living in Turkey, I didn't know very many writers, but one experience that I had, I'm a fiction writer, and prose is absolutely oftentimes my first medium to write in and to read in, but I actually felt a very strong pull to poetry because living in a community where I didn't have competency, certainly not fluency in the language, reading poetry in English with such precision of language was really, really comforting to me, to be able to interact with words in a way that had a lot of nuance beyond just like trying to buy a bus ticket or trying to get my groceries. And so I felt this real strong turn toward poetry during that time.
Yeah, I think I kind of had a similar experience, Wendy. Like I write mostly poetry and drama. And when I got to Costa Rica, I was so inspired because I don't speak Spanish by these like Google Translate conversations I was having with people. I was like, this is too good. Like I can't put this through a filter. I have to write this how it's actually happening. And one of my favorite experiences, one of my best friends I met was an Uber driver. His name is Carlos. And he loves American music. And we were listening to Radiohead's song Creep. And he kept saying like, what is creep? And I was trying to explain what a creep is through Google Translate. And so it's like little moments like that where I really need to preserve this conversation, and the honesty and the beauty that comes like through all of these filters of not speaking English, not speaking Spanish, and then how does the internet try to explain it to the other person.
I'll just jump in really quickly. For me, it was meeting taxi drivers. Here in the States, writers tend to talk about writing with other writers. We don't tend, at least my experience has been, we don't tend to talk about it with other people. But throughout, not just Kazakhstan, but all the Soviet Union, the taxi drivers were incredibly literate, and they loved to recite poetry. And it was very inspiring for me to be in an environment where, you know, so-called common people, who of course are not common at all, but people that you wouldn't expect to in the States, there in these other countries, were very open about their love of literature and really wanted to share it with you. And that was eye-opening for me and very freeing for me. I talk about literature a lot more now because of that experience.
I've had a similar experience with that in Mexico, actually. One of the reasons that I was inspired to not move back to the States after my self-given sabbatical was when I told people I was a poet, they gave me this kind of like wide-eyed look of they're impressed with that. And that's not something that really happened in the States. In the States, I say I'm a poet, and people are like, well, what do you do for money though? It's very capitalist focused. And in Mexico, everyone just feels differently about the arts in a way. I mean, not everyone, but it's just like a general cultural vibe that I got. And kind of the same, people who you wouldn't expect, Uber drivers, taxi drivers, bartenders, whatever, you know, whoever is just giving me poetry recommendations or literature recommendations, or so proud of Mexican heritage and I want to share this writer with you. And I don't know, I thought that was really my vibe. And so I wanted to stay.
Yeah, can I add to that? I've had the same experience, that mentioning that I'm a poet or even a writer in China has always been met with just utmost respect and awe. And also kind of just the understanding of how difficult that is. I think, I don't know if you guys have had the conversation with either someone who's like, yeah, oh, I write all the time. I write too. And you're just like, okay, cool, like, great, you know, whereas here in China, I say I write and everyone goes, oh, you know, I don't think I could do that. That sounds difficult. Like, I understand the creative process is not easy. And so sometimes I'm just like, how can I go home? I don't think I can. It's very hard. The respect.
Mm-hmm. Well, and related to that, I have a question, you know, about connection and community. You know, for Jen touched on this a little bit, just in terms of having some restrictions. But you know, do people feel connected to the U.S. lit scene, or have you found communities that are local to you? You know, it's in some ways it's a little different because we have so much more access via digital platforms. But you know, but also scenes can kind of vary. So I'm curious for people who are still abroad, if you feel that connection to the U.S. lit scene, publishing, or if you're going in a different direction.
Ooh, can I answer this one first? So I think for quite a long time, I was really invested in keeping a social media presence. I was on Twitter, and I was really intentional about maintaining contact with my American friends, writers back home. But then at some point, and I think the pandemic is actually what did it, I realized that I was feeling very negative. Every time I went on social media, I was comparing myself. I wasn't writing, people were publishing, I wasn't publishing. I did my morning pages, I did this, and it just started, I realized that I was feeling very negative. And so I actually chucked my Twitter account, which was a huge deal for me. And then in terms of China, I also kind of isolated myself. And so I've now been here this is going into year 7 soon. And I've been just very isolated. So in America, I had a huge writing community, sharing pages with people, meeting up with people in cities to have, conversations about writing. And yet the last 3 years, it's been almost nothing, just Monet in her head. I don't know if it's healthy, but I do think once I realized that social media was actually making me feel bad about myself and my writing, that I did make the right choice to step away from that.
Yeah, I'm really interested in what other folks have to say, but I took a large step back from social media as well. And this is after someone who had very much been an advocate for it. My background and my day job background is marketing. And I would always tell people, you have to do this. You have to use it as a promotional vehicle. And now I feel really, really differently about it.
So I have the opposite experience, I guess. I started a project that I could incorporate something visual, kind of with that idea in mind of using social media as a jumping off point to get more people to read my work. And so I started writing poetry on people's bodies and taking photos, and learned photography from scratch, kind of just on my own to do that. But that was in 2015, and I developed, a pretty decent sized community of 30,000 Instagram followers. And that actually, while it created a huge online community for me, 2 interesting things happened. One of them was a lot of people from my past came out of the woodwork, just writing to me about the project or wanting to participate. And that was really cool because I had been disconnected from my writing world in the US for a long time. And the other thing that was cool is Mexico City has a really vibrant art scene. And so a lot of people in the city were interested. And that helped me become part of the art and writing community in Mexico City. So those were really positive things that happened to me from social media that aren't necessarily related to social media itself, and kept me connected to the writing world, which I like.
I just want to quickly jump in. What Jessica's talking about is her Skin on Sundays project. And I understand she's not doing it anymore, but it is archived online. I really encourage people to check it out. It was a phenomenal project. It's fascinating. So well worth Skin on Sundays. Google it and check it out.
Thank you.
Well, should we do a second set of readings? Okay. I have it being, who's next? Jessica.
All right. So my piece is a little longer, so I'm just going to get right into it and not preface it. It's called Pascal Said Always Keep Something Beautiful in Your Mind. Raindrops on roses, angels on MDMA, to feel the boundaries of your skin. You know who you are. Expansiveness, singing, nothing lasts forever, while knowing full well everything we are is alive, is at every moment alive in us. Thanks, Arthur Miller, who's thanking California, and I'm thanking Barcelona. The sunrise, all there alone, just the new light and me, walking to the metro in a big red backpack, going somewhere. I sit down, close my eyes. When I discover that DMT is the same chemical as dreaming, when I hear 232 is the frequency that can heal you, when I find light conversations about semicolons and emotional impact of pauses, when I figure out that transparency really works. So keep trying. I'll keep trying. Do you know how often I sit among the clouds? Once I saw moonlight flashing through them like a flame. When I say I love you, what else does it mean? Living with all the uncertainty clouds is okay. Let them go. Don't think about them every day. Keep something beautiful in your mind, swaying in the dark underbelly of a sailboat out there, the big smell of water. Chaos, every minor wind, a gate ajar. It's exciting, more honest, and it's quieter. It's July. You fell asleep in my lap. Your naked feet were touching mine. Confession and confession, and still so much is secret. I dream in muffled, mythic electric guitar on my best nights. Me quedo enamorada del mundo en español. Falsetto, emoji corazones, el vino, el mar, and airports too, and home after home after home. Barcelona, I cried for the first time today since I arrived, and then I recorded the silence. This is all there is. This. I photographed the teeth marks you left on me. I let my fingers rest there, falling into sleep. Do you know how I've been afraid? Pascal said, always keep something beautiful in your mind. The moon is full in this moment, and night makes me feel alive. I'm going to sit on my balcony and drink Rioja. And you know, I like being alone. I'd even call it loneliness. I remember when we met, my soul and me. Now it's easier to see everyone.
Thank you, Jessica. Wendy.
Thanks, Jessica. Okay, I'm going to read from a short story that is set in a moon colony. It's from my new book, What If We Were Somewhere Else? On the night before, and this is just from the very beginning, on the night before Michael's stepfather, Dave, was taken to the skilled nursing facility, Michael felt sure this was not the way it should work. Dave was dying, but everyone was dying. So much had changed even in Michael's own lifetime. He couldn't imagine how his stepfather was feeling, and Michael was feeling mortality more than he ever had since he'd turned 50. Medical technology had continued to advance, and particularly in the early 2020s, there was a sense of incredible hope. Michael had been young then and hadn't cared so much about age-reversing processes or cures for arthritis, but he certainly cared now. Seeing Dave being carted off to the facility, Michael wondered what had gone so wrong. The year his stepfather had been born, 1959, man still had a decade before landing on the moon. In 2031, when Dave was 72 and Michael just 36, an international consortium had established the moon colony. It had seemed like science fiction when morning daytime TV did human interest segments on the colonists, and it had seemed like science fiction when the government started looking for volunteers. Debt and student loan forgiveness were some of the perks. Life insurance for family left behind, of course, and the legacy of living among the stars. The earliest moon colonists had been retired or washed out American astronauts, Russian cosmonauts, and Chinese taikonauts, a pool which was exhausted fairly quickly. Many of the people who had been in orbit did not want to go back, and the ones in space programs who had not made the cut in years earlier were either bitter or had moved on. The next round were military, then the civil servants, the returning Peace Corps volunteers, postal workers and city council members, teachers. There was talk of a draft, but the idea did not test well, so nations moved on to the better, more persistent recruiter, the public relation campaign.
Thanks, Wendy. So a moon colony, that's a far country indeed. I'll finish up the reading portion here. This is from my new book, Ships in the Desert, about my time living in Kazakhstan. And this is from the title essay, just the opening page I'll read, about a trip to the dying Aral Sea. And it's, again, Ships in the Desert. Two images remain with me. The first is of the Technicolor tile mosaic covering the entire back wall of the waiting room in Uralsk century-old railway station. Strong men and women, faithfully portrayed in the Soviet realist style, haul in nets teeming with fish and load them onto waiting railway cars. Large Cyrillic script spells out the reason for their industry. In response to Lenin's letter, let's load 14 train wagons of fish. The mural is a tribute to the time when Uralsk citizens helped feed a starving young Soviet nation during a famine. It's a tribute to the life-giving bounty of the Aral Sea. The second is of a fleet of rusting Soviet fishing ships, hammer and sickle still clearly discernible on many, sitting bolt upright in desert sands as if plowing through ocean waves. At that time, I had already lived for almost a year and would live for another 3 in beautiful, crazy, haunting, surreal Kazakhstan. But the sight of those ships, so lost no storm could have put them there, so dead yet so apparently alive, was the most beautiful, the most surreal. The story of how they got there is certainly the most crazy. No small boast in a land of storied fighting, infighting, greed, and corruption. That it has haunted me is why I had to write this. So that leads, I think, well, to the next question I have. It's obvious that our experiences living abroad have been reflected in the kinds of places and people we write about, and we're hearing that in the excerpts that we've been reading. But I'm curious, has it also affected more technical aspects of your writing? For example, has living overseas changed how you approach dialogue, tone, word choice, metaphor?
I'll just jump in on the dialogue question. I mean, when operating in a foreign language for so long, and then when we come back, I pick up English more. I mean, it's weird. It's always disconcerting to be back in a target and being able to overhear every conversation, where you kind of tune it out. Even though I'm fairly fluent in other languages, you don't always pick up the little bits and pieces, so you just stop listening. So when I come back, it's just like on super high volume, and I can hear everything, every table at a restaurant. It's kind of overwhelming. I guess it's given me a better ear in a lot of ways for dialogue.
Yeah, I actually had to think about ethics a lot more. Obviously, being here, I can only say so much, but I realized that I had the idea that I could write about anything I wanted to talk about was my right to write or talk about. And I learned very quickly that that's not necessarily true in terms of what I put out into the world, because it would affect other people. So I really had to kind of, I didn't realize I was so laissez-faire, just like I can do whatever I want. And it wasn't until I moved here that I realized that writers are taking risks that I didn't even realize. There are consequences for when they write things, when they say things. Those consequences can affect their lives, their families' lives. And that hadn't occurred to me until I came here. So I've learned to be respectful.
I think I've said a couple times already, not speaking Spanish made me hyper aware of every dialogue I was having. So I'm, being hypersensitive and hyper aware of every single word that's being said to me. Do I understand what's being said? Don't I understand what's being said? And, translating that into my writing, I think it's made me more aware of how many words I actually need to use to get my point across versus what I don't need to say. And so that's been really interesting. And, just the way that, I might say something in English and the way that it's phrased back to me in Spanish, I'm like, wow, that sounds way more beautiful than what I'm trying to say in English. So we had a lot of conversations about that. Like, Spanish is so much better than English. But yeah, being aware of what I'm saying, I think, has been how I've been approaching dialogue.
I think one thing that was kind of helpful for me, people I think go through this, when you start to learn a few idioms in another language, or also when you see how things like either do or do not translate. Like, for example, in Turkish, the equivalent of like what we would call in English a white lie is a pink lie, right? And so when you think about these things, like it's arbitrary. It's completely arbitrary. So as I started to think about those things, which I found, interesting and amusing, it also made me, this is kind of back to my comment about poetry, made me think a lot more about specificity and not relying on things like a white lie, because what does that actually mean? It feels like it means nothing when you're in a culture where like the context for it completely dissolves.
I have a sort of similar experience, except it's not just with idioms. Like, there's just some things that are said differently and different words that are used. So one of the first examples that I have is the seeds of a fruit. In Spanish, they're called bones. So someone I was talking to was speaking English to me, and he said tangerine bones to me, and I'm like, what are you talking about, tangerine bones? And then finally we figured out that he was talking about the seeds. And for me, that was just so eye-opening, like right in my face, to think, wow, the way that we say things is arbitrary. We just chose to call it, well, I guess seed makes sense and bone doesn't really make sense, but there's so many things in English that are the reverse. You're like, that doesn't really make sense the way that we say it, but that's just the way that you learn it. And how it's affected my writing, I guess, is just that, like, it just unlocks new ways to be creative, that you don't have to say things the way that they're supposed to be said, that you can kind of just take off, use that as a launch point to take off and say whatever will elicit the feeling the best, rather than what's right or correct.
I actually just thought about, sorry. No, I was just thinking about dialogue and overhearing conversations. And I realized the thing that has happened to me is that I create whatever I think people are saying in the conversations. So you'll see a couple having a conversation and they're speaking Chinese, and I know, enough Chinese to order dinner, but that's about it. And so I'll create a whole story based on what I think their body language is doing, or, what I think is happening. And then that's like in my mind, and those people have appeared in some of my stories with what I think was happening, having no idea whatsoever. So just the reverse of, I think about going back to the States, and I'm not looking forward to understanding everything that people are talking about. Yeah, no way.
Well, I'll go ahead and ask my next question. Folks talking about respect for poets in other countries, it's somewhat related to this, but writers in our jobs are always kind of a thing, right? Because it's extremely hard, not impossible, to make a living as a writer, and so a lot of us are doing other things for money. When I was a teacher in Turkey, the experience actually turned me away from teaching, not because I didn't like it, but because I was very well compensated as a teacher in a way that was totally different from anything I experienced in the US. And I kind of had this realization that that beginning of financial stability was really good for me emotionally. And I felt that I needed to have that kind of security to have a productive writing life. And teaching just was like not going to cut the mustard, at least how it was for me then as an adjunct at a community college. And so I'm curious about your experiences with working abroad, and if any of your decision to remain in another country is related to that security or economy and making the writing life work for you. In addition to the respect that writers have in many countries that we don't always experience here.
I can jump in here. I have a it actually does play somewhat of a factor for me. So I don't have a job in Mexico. My work is in the US remote, but based on the exchange rate and all that, I don't have to work full time to live a good life. I'm not wealthy or anything like that, but that is a conscious decision because when I work full time, I do not really write. I just value relaxing too much. So I need to work, make a living aside from my creative writing, not full time, in order to even be able to focus on writing myself. So that's not, the whole reason I live in Mexico. I really do love it here, but it does help a lot that I can sustain myself by, working 3/4 or half time, or just changing up my schedule and being able to dedicate so much time to writing and art. And that's so important to me. I don't know that I'll ever move back to the US and not have that possibility.
Mhm.
So I had kind of a weird experience. I spent 2 different periods of my life in Costa Rica. The first time was for about 3 months for an American Study Abroad program, which really wasn't, I think, the best experience to learn about Costa Rica, because it's just a bunch of Americans putting you with a bunch of other Americans teaching Americans. So I decided to come back. And the second time I came back, I had a fully remote job. And I think that really, Costa Rica isn't like the most expensive country, but it's not the cheapest country. There's tons and tons of expats here, which I think have definitely made, prices of things go up. So I kind of needed that job, but just making sure that I had, I guess, a good work-life balance, and life being my creative work, I was able to manage that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
I tried to work as a freelancer. Then I was an editor, was working with a lot of freelancers, and I saw how almost nobody could make a living unless you came into it with your own money. So I kind of realized that it wasn't going to be a long-term prospect. And it seemed like every month we were getting, as an editor, I was being told like, well, you got to pay less. You got to pay less and less. And the freelancers just kept taking it, saying they wouldn't even fight. They'd be like, okay, yeah, I'll do. And it was terrifying when you saw like, how can you can't make a living like that. So for me, I knew I had to get a different job for a long term, just to support myself, my family. So I'm very happy to be doing what I'm doing. Got into the job that I have, being able to see the world, and I get a lot of time off, more than I would get in the U.S. And that, I guess, like Jessica, my time to relax is pretty important to me. So I couldn't deal with the U.S. 2, 3, 4 weeks off per year. It's not enough to kind of live, in my opinion. So just to kind of keep that the part of me that likes to write alive, I need more time off. So I was lucky enough to find a place so I could do that and do it overseas. So
yeah, I was just going to add that I think I've reached a point, unfortunately, where teaching in China, I love teaching, and I've been here long enough where I've gotten raises every year. So I'm very wealthy in China, key point. But what that has done is I don't feel that urgency that I used to feel. So my writing has actually suffered quite a lot. I have money, opulence, I love my job. Why would I write sad poetry kind of thing? So I've kind of lost that drive, which is actually why I'm leaving, because I feel like I need that pressure again, that scramble. I think we've all had that feeling of like, I've got to write, I have to get this out, and I haven't felt that in a long time. So financial security meant losing my drive. I feel like I'm the negative Nancy on the panel, everyone. Sorry.
No,
You know, that I relate to that a little bit, because when I left my full-time corporate job for freelancing, I lost that like kind of pressure of I have to get it done. So having that uncomfortableness, I think, is positive.
Yeah, I totally agree. Actually, Monet, that's one of the reasons I left Costa Rica, was because I felt like I was retired. And I'm like in my early 30s, and I'm like, I can't feel like this. I have no pressure. I log into my online classes, you know, however many times a day, and then I'm done. And I'm like, I have no drive to do anything. I also needed that, you know, that fire. So that's one of the biggest reasons why I left Costa Rica as well.
This is fascinating. Thank you all. Let's just do a real quick hitter. Last question. Just spit out a couple of answers and we'll wrap this up. What do you recommend to other writers who might be thinking of spending some time living in another country? One or two word answers. What are the pluses? What are the minuses?
I mean, just do it. If you feel like you want to do it, nothing bad is going to happen. Everything good is going to happen. Even if it's bad, it's going to be fodder for your writing. Like, there's just no negative.
There's
Yeah, I
always a
agree.
reason not to. There's always a reason not to. So just do it.
I would recommend kind of the approach you took, Jeff, a little bit. I think Peace Corps is a great option. I think a Fulbright program, I've seen a lot of people head overseas to try to do that, and it can be really bewildering, which can be good as a writer, but it's nice to have a little bit of a support network where you have some housing or security, you know, some kind of a backup. I think, you know, like the John Keeble advice, like Uzbekistan, like find some random place that's off your map. Maybe consider doing Peace Corps or Fulbright, where you get a little bit of support. You can sink in a little bit, learn the language. That'd be my advice.
Yeah, I would say just be really open, because again, it is a very wide world, and there are countries that are popular that people like to go to, and there's nothing wrong with that. But again, you know, you might find something in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or a country that maybe you've never even heard of. So be really, really open with the idea.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Just do it would be my advice. Just do it. The world's a big world, but time is limited. So you've got one life to live, as far as we know, and just do it. So thank you all. This was really enjoyable, hearing all of your very different experiences, and also hearing about the similarities that we share from our time living overseas and how it's affected our writing. So I'm really happy that we were able to connect this way.
Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. Thanks, Jeff, Wendy, Monet, Jim, Jessica, and Krista. This was such a great conversation. It was so great to get all of our Eastern alums together for this. We're really grateful for all of you for sharing your experiences and your work with us today. I think this is going to be a really inspiring event for a lot of people. I know it was inspiring to me as someone who loves to travel and as a poet, and Liz is a poet too, so I'm sure she feels this way, but I especially loved hearing how poetry is respected so much more abroad, and all of the conversations about the specificity of language and meaning, the seeds and bones. That was all just so beautiful to hear. So thank you again, Jeff and Wendy, for moderating this conversation. And thank you to all of the writers who are here with us today from many different time zones. It's 3 a.m. right now for Monet. So thank you, especially to you, Monet, but thank you for everybody for being here today. And for everyone watching at home, I hope that you'll join us for more festival events, both in person and here on Zoom. I would also like to thank GetLit's Assistant Coordinator Liz Graves for helping with this event and so many others. The festival would not be a festival at all without Liz, so make sure to thank her if you see her around in the in-person events this week. To find our full schedule and more information about all of our authors, including today's talented panelists, please visit our website, getlitfestival.org. Thank you again for joining us today. Goodbye, everybody.